about this for how long you must have worked on it. So please take it away, Susan.
Thank you. I'll begin, and that's a good introduction. We do dream about the zoning ordinance. It's very near and dear to our hearts and minds on a daily basis. So this zoning ordinance amendment package has been working its way through the city's review process now for some time, and that review process has included very in-depth review from reviewing bodies such as the Planning Commission and your Ordinance Committee, along with public input throughout, including meetings with the Citizens Planning Association land use committees, and a lot of participation at your hearings. So we feel now presenting to the committee the codified version of the code changes that we've been discussing in both in concept and diagrammatically are now being brought forward in the form they need to be for an actual ordinance amendment. I just wanted to make one or two historical comments and future comments regarding how the zoning ordinance relates to, again, everyday work here in the city and policy, broader policy issues. The city zoning ordinance is a critical tool for implementing city policy, and over time, when experience in implementing the code or there is a new policy shift, it's really important to see that the code is in alignment and amended appropriately throughout to carry forward what is intended. And we find that for the most part, no matter what the intentions, there will need to be adjustments along the way. This zoning ordinance package was really considered a priority dating back to 2003. But the ordinance update process is extensive, and it's a major workload item, so unfortunately it has been a long time coming. But throughout, there's been good time, again, spent with those needing to consider it carefully. So we believe this package does what it was intended to do, which is to improve and clarify code language throughout some of the areas that we deal with on a regular basis that are not significant policy issues. There are a few things that could be considered policy implementing from new policy issues, like changing the setback in a parking area or something like that, you know, where we've seen other codes be amended, and we're saying it seems appropriate to carry that policy into this area. But for the most part, it is clarifications and changes to have consistency in our application. There have been, at different meetings, members of the public expressing concern about why are we doing this now while we're doing the Planned Santa Barbara update. And we think it's very important to allow the Planned Santa Barbara process to play itself out, and probably will result in needing to change the code in some way or another. It's too early to say exactly how that would be. It could be significant. The Planning Commission wants us to explore form-based coding and different issues like that. So this is not an attempt at all to think ahead about what those kinds of changes would entail. Likewise, we feel that we should not stop now and become stagnant in our current responsibilities because we're doing Plan Santa Barbara. So I've made this introductory comment at prior Ordinance Committee reports, and I'll probably be making it again at Council when it gets forwarded there. But if you have any questions about that, I'd certainly like to have an open dialogue around that broader issue if necessary as well. But turning to the actual matter at hand, Ms. Reardon will present the report. Thank you.
Ms. Reardon.
I'll turn on my mic so you can hear me. Like Betty said, there's been numerous public hearings on this draft ordinance, the concepts that were included in it beginning back in September of 2004. And most recently, we've held a series of workshops with the Ordinance Committee where we broke up the package into smaller groups to facilitate the discussion. For today, we've broken up the package into more substantive amendments and non-substantive amendments. And what we've identified as the more substantive amendments include new and revised definitions, changes to the open yard in the single-family and two-family zones, changes to the R3 and R4 yard and setback requirements, some revisions to the allowed yard encroachments, revised conditional use permit requirements, the addition of provisions for seasonal holiday sales, the clarification of setbacks along alleys and private streets, the renting of room in single-family zones, updated parking standards, and reasonable accommodations. The more non-substantive amendments include the clarification of the term yard. All throughout the municipal code, the term yard is made, and sometimes it means setbacks, sometimes it means open yard, sometimes it means private outdoor living space. So what we've done is we searched the municipal code, and every time we see the word yard, we've changed it to the actual term it's supposed to denote. Another non-substantive change is new definitions that related to these proposed amendments or deletion of redundant or non-use definitions. We're also clarifying storage on residentially zoned lots, clarifying how to determine a non-conforming fence, wall, screen, or hedge. We're proposing some minor additions and revisions to allowed uses in certain non-residential zones. We're clarifying the modification provisions. We're reformatting existing development standards. This, too, is an area where, specifically in the area of setbacks, it's in a paragraph form, and it reads on, it's not clear if this provision pertains to a building or a parking garage, so what we've done is put it in tabular form to make it more clear. We're also proposing that to clarify that the slope density applies to accessory dwelling units in the R2 zone, and we're also proposing a cleanup amendment to delete a provision that was overlooked in 1996 regarding setbacks for mixed-use projects. The purpose of today's public hearing is to review and discuss the draft ordinance, and at the conclusion, to recommend introduction and adoption to council. But specifically today, we want to focus on the elements up on the screen, and I'll go into them a little bit later in detail. But the areas are the multiple open yards on small residential lots, reduced interior and rear setbacks for parking and garages in the R3 and R4 zone, the size limitations for branch banks and medical equipment and supply stores in the CO zone, the definition for low-income senior housing development per the Housing Authority's request, and then the mixed-use standards. We will discuss all the topics as necessary during the public hearing, but these are the ones I was going to focus on in my presentation. The majority of the draft ordinance that you received, it's 99 pages. The majority is, like I said, because of our desire to clarify the term yard, and so it's referenced quite a bit. And also, the municipal code requires us that if we amend one section of an ordinance, we need to include that whole section for context, which is good, but then that drives up the page numbers. And so what we've tried to do to make it as clear as possible on what the actual changes are is that new zoning standards are underlined and deleted text are struck out, which is typical. If it's purely reformatting of existing text with no substantive changes, like the illustration I gave you with going from paragraph to tabular form where we're not changing the standards, it's not going to be underlined. But the substantive changes, they are highlighted and underlined, so that hopefully it calls your attention to them. So the first topic I wanted to cover is the multiple open yards for small lots. During review of the proposed amendments for the open yard area, the Planning Commission recommended that the open yard area be allowed to be broken up on smaller lots. And the current requirement for open yard area in the single-family zone is for one area of 1,250 square feet with a minimum dimension of 20 by 20 in any dimension, and it must be on grade. It can't include cut and filled slopes greater than 20%, a portion of the front yard, or paving or other surfaces designed for use for motor vehicles. And what the Planning Commission recommended is that single-family zone lots less than 7,500 square feet and less than 20% slope be allowed to provide this open yard area in one or more areas of not less than 400 square feet. And they wanted the minimum dimension to continue to be 20 by 20 feet, and then up to 850 square feet can be provided in the remaining front yard. The Planning Commission recognized that the size of the lot that this exception pertained to may be reduced based on research of lots that requested an open yard modification. And when we performed this research, we saw the medium size of the lots that requested an open yard mod was 7,000 square feet. And when we discussed this with planning staff, they raised concern regarding the possibility of it leading to overbuilding of the site. And their feeling was that, in ours too, that a lot that meets or is close to the minimum lot size area, and 7,500 square feet is actually the minimum lot size for the E3 zone, those lots should be able to meet the existing requirement. So what we're proposing is that the lot size be 6,000 square feet, and that truly reflects the size of lots that do have a hardship, and that it would be more appropriate to be 6,000 square feet. The second topic for discussion is interior setbacks for garages and carports in the R3 and R4 zone. What we're proposing is to decrease the interior and rear setbacks for garages and carports to 3 feet outside of the front yard from the current requirement of 6 feet. And when the Ordinance Committee reviewed this proposal, you recommended to include it in our package, but with several additions. And those are that applies to lots less than 55 feet wide, that the garage depth be limited to a maximum of 20 feet interior clear space, that no electrical or gas meters be allowed within the 3-foot setback, and that we need to provide for allowance within the allowance for landscaping and trees within the reduced setback. Staff recommends, we included in our proposal the provision for it to apply to 55 feet wide lots and to also delimit the garage depth. However, we recommend not including the changes regarding the allowance for landscaping and prohibiting the electric or gas meters within the setback. Landscape plans and site plans are required to be reviewed by the ABR and the Historic Landmarks Commission, and we believe that the design review boards should have the discretion to review those plans and require appropriate landscaping and screening as necessary. Additionally, the portions of the building that aren't garage will need to meet the R4 setback as illustrated on the side. This portion of the building would provide areas for increased landscaping. So what we're recommending is that this recommendation applies to lots less than 55 feet wide and that the depth of the garage be limited to 20 feet interior clear space. The next topic is size limitations for branch banks and medical equipment and supply stores in the CO zone. And when you reviewed our proposal to allow these types of uses in the CO zone, you suggested us to explore limitations on the size and intensity of these uses. And what we're proposing is for the branch banks to be limited to 1,000 square feet because that's the size limit of the existing conditional use provisions for areas accessible to customers. And we're also proposing to limit the size of the medical equipment stores to 3,000 square feet because that's the limit in the development plan ordinance. And businesses larger than those sizes can continue to request a conditional use permit. The next topic is the definition of low-income senior housing development, and this is the Housing Authority's request. And originally, we were proposing to establish a new parking requirement of 1/2 space per unit for residential units developed or operated by nonprofits that will be occupied by handicapped and disabled tenants. Now we're proposing to amend the existing definition of low-income senior housing to include disabled and handicapped tenants, because following the public hearing, both staff of the Housing Authority and the city's redevelopment agency felt that our previous proposal would lead to too many unintended consequences and it could be abused. So now we're proposing just to amend the definition of low-income senior housing to include handicapped tenants, which is consistent with the Housing Authority's original request. Then the last topic is in regards to the deletion of the section regarding interior yard setbacks for mixed-use buildings. The current provision states that where a dwelling unit is located, placed, or erected above another type of use in zones other than the A, E, or R zone, the interior yards for the floors occupied for dwelling purposes shall comply with the provisions of the R4 zone. This section should have been deleted in 1996 with the Council's actions on the mixed-use incentive. At that time, it was a clear understanding by everyone, by the Planning Commission, the Ordinance Committee, the Design Review Boards, and the City Council, and the public, that no setbacks were required for mixed-use projects in the commercial zones. It was just an oversight that it was left in there, and we've always viewed this as being a cleanup amendment, and it has always been included in our proposal. So our overall recommendation for today is to review and discuss the draft ordinance, specifically in the areas that I discussed, the multiple open yards for small lots, to give direction on what the maximum size should be for the lots that could apply for that exception. Additional discussion on the interior setbacks for garages and carports in the R3 and R4 zone. Again, we're proposing for it just to apply to the 55-foot wide lots, and then the size limitations for branch banks and medical equipment and supply stores, just a verification whether the sizes that we've proposed are adequate. And then at the conclusion, to recommend introduction and adoption to the City Council. And if there's areas that the committee is split on, if we could separate those motions out so then the City Council has a clear understanding of where there was consensus and where there wasn't. Additionally, we have reserved space on your next agenda, July 1st. So if we don't get through it all today, we do have next week to complete the review. Thank you.
But ideally, it would be to get through these issues because we have plenty more for next week.
Correct.
Because there's at least a couple of things that I'd like to ask to talk about that are not on your highlight list.
Chair Williams, we're hoping to get through the whole thing today if possible. So let's, but
Very ambitious.
yeah, but we reserved it just in case that doesn't happen. So if we can, some of these things we want to talk to you about, but we hope that they won't take a whole lot of time, and then we can move on to the substantive issues and then to the non-substantive issues, because we just want to,
So we have highlighted issues, substantive issues, and non-substantive issues. Those are your
Correct.
three categories.
Yeah, the substantive issues are the highlighted ones, and what we wanted to focus on and we needed more direction on are the three items on the screen. But any questions or any topics are up for discussion today.
Okay. Well, why don't we first do one thing, which is to take questions on the issues that you've highlighted from the committee, and in addition to that, issues that we want to go deeper in that are not on that list. We wouldn't take those up right now, but do that either when we're done with these or next week. So we'll hear from council members first and then from members of the public, just on questions and on other issues that need to be highlighted.
Are they planning on doing a presentation on this?
With staff.
Are you planning on doing a presentation on this?
no, our presentation's done. So just discuss and we'll answer questions and we'll try to do what we can.
And Chair Williams, I forgot one point. I made extra copies of the ordinance, draft ordinance, and I placed them up on the front desk here. So if there's anyone in the audience that would like a copy of it. And I also have the transparencies that were included as attachments to the council agenda report that we can flash up on the screen too if necessary.
Thank you for providing members of the public more light reading. You want to withhold questions until members of the public? Okay. We'll take public comment without any current questions yet. We'll take public comment. So Judy Reyes, followed by Steve House.
Hi, I'm Judy Arias, and I'm here to speak about the 3-foot setback by garages in the R3 and R4 zone. I understand that the state code requires you to have a 3-foot setback, and I don't think that that is anything more than a minimal standard, and that the city of Santa Barbara should go above this requirement and increase it. The staff's argument that since R2 and the single-family zone already has 3 feet is not really applicable. R3 and R4 has multiple units with multiple people living in them. The city cannot regulate the number of people in a unit, so you can assume that there are going to be a large number of people living in the R3 and R4 units. In the construction of these units, you usually see the living room, dining room, kitchen at the front where the front door is, and the bedrooms are placed at the back where you have the setbacks. And the windows are generally for the bedroom are in the back. In our area, as you well know, we have earthquakes, 98% predicted, and we have fires. And these are a reality that we have to deal with in all of the zones. To having just a 3-foot setback when the garages are constructed is a hazard for the evacuation of these people. In all probability, you will find an 8-foot fence on the other side of the property, which also cuts down the 3-foot accessibility. If you will recall the down ramp at the Gebhardt building where you generally meet, that ramp exceeds 3 feet. And you can't walk 2 people down that ramp. The doors to a tract house are 2 feet 8 inches, and you have problems dealing with wheelchairs in that, and I know from experience. The question about landscaping being left to the ABR and landmarks, how and what can be grown in a 3-foot setback? And can people use that setback as evacuation? I have a degree in botany, and I can tell you that to have a significant tree, you need more than 3 feet. And you need the landscaping to soften the size, bulk, and scale of these R3 and R4 buildings. There are many, many reasons why there should be an increased setback for these buildings. And it is not in the best interest of the potential residents, the architectural design, and especially the safety of the people who are going to live in these buildings to reduce this to 3 feet where there is a garage wall. Now, if the garage is open parking and people can get through and walk on where the parking is, then it's okay. They have the expanded thing. It's the walls that restrict them that is going to cause problems. And I can see this coming down the road as a very serious problem. And we can exceed the state. We don't have to sit and do what a bunch of contractors in Sacramento want. We can have a decent setback and protect the residents of this building. Thank you. Do you have any questions? Thanks.
I actually do, Judy. The staff report mentions that this was the amount that was established as part of the recently completed NPO.
Yes.
What's maybe a question both for staff and for you. What do you feel about the necessity of that consistency, or can you elaborate on that?
Well, first of all, you're not consistent because you're dealing with R3 and R4, which are multiple units with a lot of people in, which is different than R2 and single-family housing. Personally, I think the 3-foot setback that was adopted in the NPO as a compromise is a mistake. You need to have space, overhangs of the roof, etc. It increases the fire potential. Nothing beats space for safety. And when you figure that the way the units are usually configured, and if there's a fire and the front is unable to be utilized, they're going out the back windows, and then all of a sudden they've got this wall, these 2 walls 3 feet apart, and it's not a good safety factor. Plus, landscaping, it's great to leave it to the ABR and the landmarks, but what can they do with 3 feet? Not much. So you're dealing with apples and oranges. The NPO and the R2 is something else. We're dealing with multiple dwellings, R3 and R4, and there's a difference. And there are a lot more people. And again, the city cannot regulate how many people live in a unit. And you have to think of people's safety and plan. It's too late when the fireman goes in and finds the bodies because they couldn't get out, or you got to plan ahead, and you have to think of people's ability to get out of a place. And maybe staff wants to add.
No, I do want, because my initial thought is, well, why would the standard be more restrictive in the single-family zone than in the multifamily zone for this? But
Yes, I think generally the thought process that single-family zone and then even R2 are more restrictive in terms of density and then require more open space also, which I understand Mr. Rios' concern, and staff also was concerned about the fact that in the R3, R4 zone, you can have larger buildings, and even just having a greater setback to account for the fact that when you put 3 or 4 units together, that's a larger building. So I understand where Ms. Arias is coming from, I think, and staff also had some concerns about it. But then on the flip side, the concern here is we have for many years now been looking at developments just like the one on the board. And this is one of those areas where it's somewhat of, are we implementing current policy through this code change? Are we setting new policy? Do you want these to be handled on a case-by-case basis? Lots of 55 feet in width or less fairly routinely request this modification that you're seeing on the board there. And we felt that we could develop a standard which allowed the reduced setback for a very specific use, the garage only and only a minimum size garage. And so that's where staff is coming from. We think it's consistent, as you say, with other zones. I think the other zone examples are more responsive, however, to Ms. Arias' concern. There tends to be more space on the property from which to, evacuate in the case of an emergency, and you don't need the setback as much for relief of larger buildings. So there are differences, certainly, but we felt this was an appropriate standard.
So, Mr. House, I'm going to ask you to wait just for a second because the committee members now have questions. You're just.
I want to hear the.
Mr. Francisco.
Just one brief comment on this topic. This project that you have up there illustrating the 3-foot setback, this is a project that when it came before the council, I voted against, and Chairman Williams voted against. And I know at least part of the reason that I voted against it was because of the setbacks, and because that I felt that this building loomed too large, and that having the inadequate setback was part of the reason that it didn't look right. And I just also wanted to point out that that 3-foot setback I discovered during the site visit didn't really exist, because the pillars on the fence encroached into it. It had pillars about this wide that encroached into that setback, so the real width of the setback was 2.5 feet. Anyway.
Mr. House.
Well, first I have to tell you that I get paralyzed with fear standing at this podium and looking at you, but having told you that, I can get over it now and be relaxed.
Watching you in sign committee, and it makes it really hard to imagine that you're paralyzed by anything.
It's much easier. I don't know why that is. I actually didn't come here with comments on this subject, but I would say that the project that I did have some comments about is in an R4 lot, and it's a single-family residence. And so I was visualizing this discussion in the context of that, where you might have a driveway parallel to one of the property lines that's perpendicular to the street. And so you want to maximize the size of the house and get that driveway and the garage over to the side. And so when talking about the 20-foot clear interior dimension of the garage, I was visualizing that as a limitation of the length of the encroachment, which is obviously not the case here. And so that's a potential issue that if there was no reason at ABR that they directed them to do otherwise, you could have the entire length of that building encroaching to within 3 feet of the property line. So that's a majorly different thing. I guess speaking first to what is on staff's report today, I haven't been to any of your other ordinance committee meetings on this topic, and I saw a little bit of one on TV. But I am curious to know a little bit more about the interior yards for residential and non-residential zones. And so if I understand what you're saying is that you're clarifying it so that it is acceptable if you have a small amount of commercial, then all the residential can be up to the property line. Is that a correct understanding?
Chair Williams, that's correct. That's the standard that we've been using ever since 1996.
Okay. I think that, as has been observed about various different things, they're well-intentioned when initially adopted, and then you find out what the consequences of these are later. And at Historic Landmarks Commission, and I did not come here to speak on behalf of HLC, but since this topic came up, I would say that we are seeing situations where the applicant uses, shoehorns in 100 square feet of commercial in order to get the residential much closer to the property lines without any modifications required. And we're seeing that as a big potential problem. So I would rather see a lot more study on this. There should either be a threshold of the amount of commercial that you have to have before you can do this, because it just doesn't make sense if you get some little token amount of commercial in there, voila, you've got that much more property to use. What I did come here to talk about is I have a project that involved a stair, an exterior stair, going to an added structure. It's in an R4 zone. It's in the rear yard of the property, and there's a different first and second floor setback there. I kind of thought staff was going to put this on the discussion because, over the course of 4 months I had various different discussions about it. And the long and short of it is that staff decided that best know that's the way we've interpreted it, and their previous decision is going to stand. It's certainly something ripe for discussion and clarification. I don't want to take up your time right now if you have other things you need to discuss and resolve, but I certainly would like it to become part of the discussion. And on that point, I would just also like to bring up another topic, because maybe this is easily clarified by the city attorney, but I note in 2898 enforcement and penalty, it says the provisions of this title shall be interpreted by the city attorney. So I kind of have a problem with getting an answer when I'm declined on something that's the way we interpret it. And there may not be any basis written in the zoning ordinance to stand on, but that's how we interpret it. And that's extremely frustrating for me as a designer, and I think that there should be a lot more transparency and openness about that sort of thing. If something's going to be added, changed, whatever, it ought to be as the result of a process like this instead of just a staff interpretation. And, once again, the long and short of it is I never got an answer why this stairs I had proposed was not acceptable, just that, okay, we see that we've interpreted it differently under different circumstances and we need to be consistent in our interpretation. I never have found out why. So that's all I want to say right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. House. Any questions first, or areas that we need to further cover? I have a couple in addition to. I'd like to talk about churches in the M zone. If we don't do that today, I'd like to talk about it next week. And regulations for non-residential building structures and uses in the double setback or the exemption from double setbacks. Is that in? That's not in today. Oh, it is. Okay, we can talk about that. Great. And the sloped areas portion of, that's, so I'm going to ask that question right now. What is the thought behind allowing 20% cut and fill slopes to count towards the open yard requirement?
Chair Williams, currently natural areas that are greater than 20% slope are allowed to count towards the open yard requirement. However, if a property owner, actually go to the end, I have a slide. If a property owner decides to terrace his backyard, to put retaining walls and terrace it, that area is no longer considered part of the open yard area. And it's more of a fairness issue. If you have a natural slope, it can count towards the open yard requirement. And so here's an example here that the top slide, or the top part, shows a slope over 20%, and you have a small back area. So if the property owner wants to cut into the hill and do a retaining wall and have a nice outdoor area there, that area does not count as part of their open yard area, although it's more usable. They've made it so it's more usable. Also, the other change is in regards to decks. Similar idea. You have a sloped area, and it counts as your open yard area. It's not really usable, but if right now, if you wanted to put a deck in your open yard area, that area would no longer qualify as your open yard, so you'd need to get open yard modification. So another part of that proposal is to allow decks less than 36 inches in height to encroach into your open yard area. So it's more of a fairness type issue.
Aren't you concerned that that could increase the likelihood that an area will be graded and filled? I mean, if a property owner has no incentive to leave the natural slope, I mean, right now, that's a very strong incentive to leave the natural slope, as in the example above, and not need a retaining wall, which, preserving the natural slope, we have some interest in doing as a city. Aren't we concerned that we're then incentivizing cut and fill of a slope to make it more, I guess, desirable for the property owner, but less desirable for the surrounding community?
Yeah, I just wanted to add that where this is usually an issue is on smaller lots where it's not entirely random. It is related to the original cut and fill done for the subdivision and the roads, that you find yourself with a lot that happens to have some over 20% slope or under 20% slope. And these minor distinctions in the lay of the land end up having one neighbor not need a modification and another one need a modification for things like even just repairing existing retaining walls. If they have existing retaining walls and they need to terrace another portion, that would be seen as taking out or reducing front yard. I wholeheartedly agree that the conservation element goal for reducing grading and maintaining natural slopes is an important city goal. We don't really see it played out in these cases where on smaller lots where they're grappling with the 1,250 square feet, that it is a highly visible hillside or ridgetop or something like that. And on larger lots where we are dealing with subdivisions, the Planning Commission or the staff hearing officer really does look at the creation of the lots and where are the slopes. And usually this is not a problem in new subdivisions. It's avoided the way the city practices its policy and grading review. But Riviera, I mean, I'd really invite anybody to spend some time with our modification hearing officer agendas and site visits to the Riviera. I mean, that's mod land galore. I mean, it's incredible. So this is primarily for infill little niches of the city that have hillsides, and it really is not practice on the larger lots at all.
And then how about Mr. Cotto knows that I'm always asking questions about hotels and not in residential areas. So in having non-residential buildings in residential neighborhoods, we require a double setback currently, with an exemption for conversions of residential units to hotels, but the remodels do have an exemption to the double setback, correct?
It's actually the opposite, which is why we're doing this. The way it is now, if you have an existing house in the R3, R4 zone, actually the R4 zone, and you want to convert it to a bed and breakfast, and you have just the regular setbacks, you don't need a modification.
Right.
But because of the way that language is written currently, if you had an existing bed and breakfast that was 6 feet away, that had the single setbacks, and you wanted to remodel it, you'd need a modification.
Right.
Which is just stupid,
I guess my question, I guess I agree that leaving them inconsistent is not wise, but why not make the consistency the other way and require the double setback of both?
Well, Chairwoman, for two reasons. First of all, we're trying to the idea is to preserve the house. Right, you have a house that meets the setbacks. You want to convert it to a bed and breakfast. You want to convert it because that's what bed and breakfasts, they're beautiful old houses that are converted over. And by requiring the double setback, then that sort of encourages people to demo the house and build something that conforms, which we don't want. So that's why the conversion language is in there to begin with, is because we're trying to preserve, and then what we're trying to do is add so that once it's there, you can do some remodeling and not have to go through our process.
Do we know that the double setback is not a double setback in remodels is not a significant barrier to people doing a conversion in the first place? Because what I'm concerned about is then what if this is an additional incentive to see more conversions of residential property to non-commercial uses or to commercial uses?
Chairwoman, I don't see it as an incentive. The incentive's already there. The incentive exists in the current code. Anyone can come in and convert an existing house and not meet the double setbacks.
So again,
so it's already,
why not do a double setback so that there is a disincentive to convert?
Because then you lose the structure. I mean, there's that risk and that potential. And that's sort of the encouragement, we don't, it's sort of like the city saying, we don't want this house to remain. We want it to be demoed and replaced with something else. And that's the opposite message that we're trying to send.
Yes, this is a prime example of, at the time that the council set this policy, there were many B&B operators here, and explaining that this had value for different neighborhoods of the city as well as the economy of the city, and we looked at our zoning ordinance and we changed a number of sections relative to allowing for B&Bs in certain instances. And I think this was an oversight, that if we were going to support this land use and the conversion of existing structures, and yet another section of our code and application does not allow someone to change the windows or put in an additional skylight in the roof of this structure because it's not double setback. I mean, double setback is 12 feet into the structure. It's very hard to make improvements to that structure. I think this was an oversight. And we're not proposing to set policy in this regard or change policy. We're trying to be consistent with the policy that was set regarding B&Bs in the past.
Mr. House, you've been patient with your questions.
Well, on that one, I'll just weigh in right away, and I think that the recommendation is going in the right direction, and that we want to be encouraging the preservation of existing structures where it's possible, and there was a time when the value of the bed and breakfast, sort of that very modest kind of low impact hospitality in our community was driven to the surface, and people appreciated that. Going the other way, we want to make sure that we don't have incentives that would cause harm to the neighborhood, and that kind of a requirement would really be a promotion of an unintended consequence, I think is the words I'd use. But in any case, I just wanted to go down some of these items on the list that we had. The multiple open yard areas for small single-family zoned lots, and I like the way that it's been finally kind of crafted down to where we have the 400 and 850 and that whole arrangement. And then I was looking to see how usable open yards were referenced for each of the different zones, because I finally got the rhythm of how this is in here, where it goes through each of the different zones, and there's a repetitive language and all. But it is distinct when you get to multifamily, multiple dwelling units, where you do have the ability to have that anywhere in the lot, and it's not. It could be, if I understand correctly, it could be on a podium, and I want to verify that for the single family neighborhoods, all those, there's a real clear requirement that it can't be on top of a structure that's higher than 36 inches off the ground, that kind of stuff. So I get that. And then we keep that language all the way through until we get to the multifamily. And there we're allowing for the possibility that and I'm imagining, we've seen this, a parking structure can be underground or be in a first floor, and there can be essentially a usable outdoor space that's on the top of that. Could you clarify that for me to be sure that I'm on the right track? I was looking real hard here to try to find it in my notes here, but...
Chair Williams, Councilmember House, yes, that's correct, and sort of. It's a little bit more nuanced than that. Unfortunately,
Okay.
This whole thing is so nuanced. But okay, in the R3 zone, there's two different ways to provide open space. They call it outdoor living space. One is the private outdoor living space method, and one is the common outdoor living space method. Private is the private balconies. And with the private balconies, those can be on upper floors. They can be just they don't have to be on the ground. But with common open yard, that's 15% of the lot, 20 by 21 area. That actually does have to be on the ground.
Okay.
And then back to the private outdoor.
But that's an either or.
That's
a
either or.
choice that's made as to whether each of the condominiums or whatever they are will provide their own individualized open space, or if it's more of a communal setting, whether they're going to provide it in like a little plaza or some area that would be shared.
That's correct. And additionally, another thing that we have proposed, and the Ordinance Committee has bought off on in previous concept reviews, was, and if you're providing it in private outdoor living space, we are proposing a new requirement that a small 15 by 15 common area be provided, and it could be on any floor. It could be on a roof deck or second floor. It wouldn't matter. Everyone have their own little private outdoor living spaces, plus a space that would be accessible to everybody, so that kids can ride around on their tricycles, or or communal barbecue, that sort of thing.
The genesis of that idea.
I'd like to address that. There's the Planning Commission has been seeing these condominium projects over the years, where when you provide the private outdoor living space, the site plan looks like the one that you saw before, and this is their idea to add outdoor living space in the multiple family projects. This is a new requirement for 15 by 15. So it's creating a new space, which they like to see as an amenity in these multiple family projects. Another important fact on the private outdoor living space, when you build just the decks or patios, you're required to have 10% open space on the land.
All the way down to.
Yes. So that was a controversial modification hearing at City Council, where a modification was not granted because they wanted to have green space on the land of approximately 10%. So we didn't want to have the whole site be podium. But I can tell you that there have been instances where that modification has been granted, but not nearly.
Now, can that be provided as front yard, or does it have to be inside the interior?
Yes, there's all kinds of things that can't be included in the 10% open space, things like walks, driveways, setbacks.
Right.
So when you do the private little balcony approach, you have to lay out some of the land as 10%. But now the Planning Commission is saying, okay, you do that and find somewhere for a 15 by 15. This is the Commission's direction to the community, with council approving it, is that they would like to see more usable open space in the multiple family projects.
Got it. Okay. Then let's just take that to the next iteration, which is actually number 5 in your list. And I've been around long enough to know that if you have commercial development in a downtown area, commercially zoned area, there's no setback. There's zero setback. So buildings are actually designed to be built, even if there's no building next to it right now, it's designed so there'll be maybe that gazillionth of a foot space between the two, but they'll be right next to one another and go straight up, and they use the lots at 100% of their, okay. And then with the idea of encouraging housing to be mixed into our commercial area, the idea of mixed use came up. We had the mixed use overlay and that whole conversation, which allowed us to essentially incentivize, just by creating the possibility of a mix of housing and commercial in the downtown area, and the awareness that there's no requirement on the adjacent property that they're going to build a mixed use project. They could build a straight up zero lot line commercial project right there. And so the concern about creating these little dead zones between, the residential and the commercial led everyone, I believe you were right, to come to the notion that, heck, if you're in the downtown, if you're in a commercial area, then whether it's residential or whether it's commercial, we better plan on that there's going to be zero lot line. Somebody next door could well build a commercial property, and we should just go ahead and plan for that. And I believe that that's the right direction. I see here that you say setbacks for mixed-use projects, and we're essentially correcting, I believe, what was a clear oversight, because ever since it's been interpreted in the commercial areas that mixed use should not be disincentivized by having these setbacks against a blank wall, but that they should be planned for to be fit into the commercial context, and the zero lot line was allowable there. It doesn't mean that they can't benefit from the wedding cake effect further up. In fact, that's been encouraged a lot, and there's been places where the access to the sunlight and all has been really encouraged and designed. So I'm commenting that I believe that that's on the right track there. But my question goes now to this usable open space and mixed-use projects in the downtown. And where is it in here? Do we address that in here? And if so, I don't know where it is. We are R2, R3, R4.
In condominium development, if it's mixed use, which is the concern,
Right.
You have to apply the outdoor living areas of the R3, R4 zone.
Okay.
So that new 15 by 15 that we were talking about, that's an outdoor living requirement that must be, would be applied in these mixed-use projects now.
Is that required on the ground, or may that be on the podium?
Again, it could, the Planning Commission felt, and we felt it could go anywhere on the site.
Like the same language that we have in here. For
right.
the
It
open
is the
space.
exact
Okay.
same language. We just, when you do mixed use, you will be reading that new section.
Understood.
So it's the exact same, yeah.
Okay, that makes sense. I just wanted to, that now I can see how that practically could apply. My concern was that we were going on that particular kind of space in a commercially zoned area. We were requiring some kind of a hole in the project that went down to the ground in the middle of a parking lot or something, which doesn't make any sense for real practical benefit for the kids or for seniors or anybody else. Okay, and then the setbacks on garages and carports, at first, and I think like Mr. House, I read that as a, my concern was came from the single-family home and the little garage in the back with the ribbon driveway. And then I realized that that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about R3 and R4. And the issue really truly has to be, how do we deal with the car on the property? The whole requirement that they are able to come out facing into the street instead of backing out into the street. Am I correct in understanding that that's the operational concern here? That they are able to maneuver out of the garage, which is not one that's facing at right angles, or actually parallel to the street, and that what they do is we wanted to be able to back out and come out facing forward as they drive into the street. And so on the lots that we're seeing these requested, they're just right for this group of condos or whatever, and just a couple of feet too small to accommodate the movement of the car. And now here's the push and shove. The push and shove has to do with if we allow for that movement for the car, then we're going to be encroaching into the side yard setback, and how much is allowable. And And I understand the concerns about access. And one of the things that worries me, I think 3 feet probably is adequate. My worry is that 3 feet filled with other stuff isn't adequate. And I think the comment about the fence and the way the abutments for it are, or perhaps required trees in that space, began to be problematic. So it seems to me that if we're going to make that kind of a allowance, there needs to be a complementary piece of it that has to do with that 3 feet really is 3 feet and doesn't get filled with stuff, or it's only 2 feet and there's a foot abutment in it or something, but that the actual space that's left over after all is said and done, appurtenances and things, that they are all, that it allows for the 3 feet. So just a comment there, and I see the operational value of doing that. And where's the branch bank and medical equipment piece? I never quite understood that. So where is it in here?
Chairwoman, Commissioner, Councilmember House, it's in 2 locations. One's in the CO zone, which is section 2848, I believe. And
I think it's so great that you know all this stuff this way. It's amazing. Okay.
Page 39, I think.
Mm-hmm. Okay, got it.
Yes, page 39.
yeah, we have it page 39.
And you're just adding the permitted uses with the specifying the square footage for each of them.
Correct. Currently, a branch bank of any size requires a conditional use permit, and a business specializing in sick room supplies and equipment, also of any size, requires a CUP. And what we were proposing early on was to just say, well, those businesses don't need CUPs. And at the last, I think it was the last ordinance committee meeting of March 18th, we had a member of the public come up and say, well, you know, that could open it up for any size bank, and that's not what we want, and that isn't what we wanted as staff either. And the ordinance committee said, well, let's look at some size limitations. So we went back and looked, and what's a decent size for a little branch bank. 1,000 square feet seemed like a good amount, plus it's the minor addition size for Measure E.
I see.
And then a business, medical supply, they need to put out their beds and whatever, all their different things to display. So that we thought that needed to be bigger. And we said 3,000 feet because that's the small edition size. It seemed a reasonable
This is like the little
compromise.
branch Rabobank over near Cottage Hospital.
Correct.
That's in the CO zone, and it's a little old house that they've converted into a branch bank.
Correct.
So we're talking about diminutive. So you're putting parameters around it by identifying the size. Other than that, if it were to be bigger, they'd have to come in and request a conditional use permit.
Correct.
Got it. In the R3 and the CO zones.
Just in the CO zone.
Just in CO zone. Okay, good. All righty. And then, and I don't have any problems at all with the additional deal with the handicapped, disabled persons reference in the low-income senior housing developments. I do have a question going all the way back to the first page of the attachment 1 about rabbits, chickens, and fowl. But the reason I'm asking it has something to do with the way we use the terms interior setback. And this is down in A4, third line, at the end of the line. This is so retro to talk like this. Is great. Any such cage, hutch, or coop shall be located in the interior setback. My understanding was that when you're in the interior setback, you're standing in the space between your property line and the required non-developed area. Is this a mistake, or am I misunderstanding? You meant inside the space, inside the yard, but you took out the word yard there and put setback. So I was confused about that. And not to nitpick, but my concern is we are changing these, the use of the word yard and setback throughout the entire document. And I'm concerned that if we're consistent with this, we may be confusing people and having it backwards.
Yeah, we missed that one. I think what this is supposed to, what it used to say, what it currently says, and what we still want it to say, and it's a mistake, is that if a chicken coop has to be at least 100 feet away from a side setback, a side property line. I think that's what this is, what it says now, and we don't want to change that. This is definitely something that I looked at several times and completely missed.
Okay, well, my request would be to just go through where we've actually replaced the word yard with setback throughout the rest of it, and just be sure we didn't make the same little mistake, okay?
Yeah, we will check everything.
Okay, thanks.
Good catch, Mr. House. I guess though, I'm wondering or suggesting an approach with the 3 versus 6 foot setback issue. There is some logic to me of when in doubt, pick the more restrictive of the two, because applicants can still come in for modification. Now, I know we don't want to have a ton of modifications, and that's why we're here in the first place, to try to do some of the zoning ordinance changes so that we don't have as many routine mods that seem to be very understandable that applicants would be going for. But I guess that would be my one response, is that if we feel like sometimes 3 feet is appropriate and sometimes 6 feet is appropriate, then we should probably have it 6 feet, and look at the other ones on a case by case basis. You can't really very well go the other way, is I guess what I'm suggesting. Mr. Francisco.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A few questions. One is about one of these minor changes here, for instance, on the bottom of page 2, changing the definition of the bed and breakfast inn, and just noting that it's synonymous with hotel, which is what you get to if you go to the section where the hotel is defined. So I don't have any problem with doing things like that, but it did bring up a question in my mind: how do we regulate what sort of other businesses are associated with a hotel? Because, I think traditionally most people assume that a large hotel can have a public restaurant and even public shops, retail shops. But we wouldn't want that, obviously, in a bed and breakfast in a residential neighborhood. So how is that controlled? I'm just curious about that.
In the R4 zone, in the uses permitted, let me find the page. Is it listed in here? Okay, well, we don't have that section of the code because we're not amending it, but in the R4 zone where it specifies allowed uses, it does say restaurant, or it says hotels can have related facilities like a health spa, a restaurant, and it provides certain limitations on the size, the orientation of it. It can't be focused towards the street. It has to be interior. If they want to provide a larger restaurant, then they need to apply for a conditional use permit.
Okay.
So it's in the uses permitted section of the R4 zone.
Okay. And I also wanted to emphasize the point that Steve House made about this idea. I don't know if you've looked at it, but it seems to me worth thinking about the ratio of commercial to residential in a mixed-use building, because I have seen projects where it seemed like a little postage stamp of commercial was being put in there to get the mixed-use setbacks.
Yes, I think that is a significant concern in looking at mixed-use standards for the city, which we may end up having new and different set of mixed-use standards. What we're trying to do to deal with that problem right now is encourage the ABR HLC Planning Commission to consider whether or not the site has adequate open space and setbacks. Again, this allowance that you can have a 0 setback in the commercial zones, even for commercial buildings, is not always the end result in a design review and land use approval process. We do feel that if the reason for eliminating the setbacks is, as Mr. House said, one of the reasons was compatibility long-term in a commercial area where it's not unusual to have buildings, and you're just looking at it from a form standpoint, then this flexibility with the setback makes sense. But I think people are getting hung up on the use, that the mechanism to achieve it is the use. So this whole form and use issue really is part of, I think it is, at least from the Planning Commission standpoint, and you'll be hearing recommendations from them at some point as to how they would like to see form and use, in particularly in the downtown areas where we may be seeing, to see higher density and mixed-use projects.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, so it's definitely on point. This amendment, as we explained last time, is just this one leftover thing related to what we did in the 90s.
I understand.
Yeah. Yes.
Also, as I was going through here, and I noticed the change to the definition of boarding house, and I'm curious about, and of course this doesn't bear directly on this, but since you're here, I'm going to ask you anyway. We have a huge problem with houses in single-family zones being occupied by, say, 10 or 12 people, all of them using it essentially as a boarding house, though a lot of them I don't think would meet this definition. If they do their own cooking, for instance, I guess it's not a boarding house. Do we have any enforcement tools at all that we can use in those kinds of situations?
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, there are enforcement tools that deal with the nuisance effects of a large number of people living in a single-family home. They deal with parking. They deal with noise complaints. So there are a number of different things. There are limitations on the way the city can zone or regulate who lives in a single-family residence from a zoning perspective. The city attempted to do it, and the California Supreme Court explained that our original attempt was intrusive into the privacy of the individuals living there. Other jurisdictions have since attempted other methods of regulating the number of, it really gets to the number of unrelated individuals living in a single-family residence. And other jurisdictions have attempted to regulate the number of leases that can be had in one single-family home. In other words, they were experiencing that a single-family home with 4 bedrooms had 4 unrelated individuals living there, all on separate leases. So the city said, well, that's a boarding house. That's the situation. That's what we're trying to get at. The city, actually, this was the city of Lompoc, asked this California Attorney General for an opinion on how could they do this. Could they regulate the number of leases that are in a single family home? The Attorney General came back with an opinion that said, yes, you may, that just regulating the number of leases would not impact the privacy interests of those individuals. So the city of Lompoc went around and they developed an ordinance that restricted the number of separate leases that could come out of a single-family home. They found.
Can I ask how you enforce that?
Well, that was my next point. The city of Lompoc does not enforce that ordinance, and I'm not sure if it even. I think it's still on the books, but the city of Lompoc has abandoned enforcement of that ordinance for this reason, that it takes very little to coach your tenant to say, if a zoning enforcement officer shows up or anybody with a city shirt on asks you how many leases are here, you just say we all live together. And the enforcement case falls apart. It becomes very difficult to factually establish the case necessary to enforce on that kind of scenario. And that's why the recommendation in today's staff report, both from the staff as well as our office, is a recommendation that we approach these problems of having a large number of persons living in a single-family home from the nuisance standpoint. Go after the parking in the setback, the parking in the front yard where it's not allowed, the noise complaints if such conditions exist. Those we have a better track record in enforcing on, as opposed to getting into how many leases are on this property. Are you related or not, which you're not allowed to ask. And so those are our recommendation is to try. We understand the problem. We've heard the complaints. We think that the efforts of staff are better poised on the nuisance complaints as opposed to trying to regulate this from a zoning perspective.
Okay. Thank you. One last question. Going back to this project here, I realize that the turning constraints on a car was part of what decided how wide the driveway area had to be, and that pushed it back, and so the developer wanted a smaller setback. I understand that. Is part of that because, are these kinds of developments required to have garages, or could they have carports?
Two things. Yeah, they are allowed to have carports, but we know that the ABR and the Historic Landmarks Commissions do not like them. They much rather have garages. Oh, apparently it's in the ABR guidelines that they don't routinely approve carports. The reason it's a design issue, it's sort of if you have a second story or a third story above a carport, it sort of looks like a floating house, and that's just not aesthetically pleasing.
Thank you.
Mr. House? Yeah, so on, let's see, 29.87.060, 29.87.060, setback encroachments is where we really deal with what goes in those side yards. And it seems to me that that's a place where we could really address the concerns that we heard from Ms. Arias and others when we actually had that hearing, because we really have to ensure that there is a clear space there, and some language could be added to that section that addressed that if there were to be a setback that allowed for the encroachment of a garage in the R3 and R4 zone, as we're talking about, then a requirement that be a clear space, just like it says there. It says the setbacks are required in this ordinance. They shall not be less in depth or width than a minimum, et cetera, and they shall be at every point unobstructed by structures, et cetera. So that we adopt language that's similar to that and find a way to accommodate that. And I say that because of the value that we have placed on using the resource of the land in those multiple family areas very efficiently by putting the proper number of homes there when they are redeveloped. And so anyway, I bring that up as a possible way to really address these concerns in a place where it could go. In the conversation about the mixed-use business, I think you got it right about the form issue. That's where I was coming from in terms of compatibility, in terms of form and function, in the sense of those spaces and what fits where. But there is this other important dynamic which comes up from Mr. House's comments. Part of the benefit of having housing, this is a big policy issue, I know, but part of the benefit of having housing in the commercial, along with, say, Measure E, which restricts commercial development to some degree, a large degree, is that you're displacing a higher impact commercial with lower impact housing. The impacts, if you measure them, would be less, and so we're not trying to discourage housing. On the other hand, the commercial benefit on the street level is a vitality to the street and an activity and aliveness. And if you get it where you just have, elite homes from the ground up, you can indeaden an entire street if you don't have something right on the street that brings it back to life. So I'm fascinated by this idea of a percentage or something, and it seems like that needs to be in a Plan Santa Barbara conversation. And I'm glad we're taking up the particular issue of what was left over from the 90s here today, but I'm eager to see us come up with some better way to deal with balancing those two issues, the reduction of impact for housing in a downtown versus the need for the continued vitality on the street of the commercial. Let's see if I had another thing. Oh, I'm glad to see the SD1 and SD2 addressed in the setbacks for the different floors identified in there, so that you have your progressively further back setbacks, and that's in there. I was just trying to find any of these other little things that we could pick up here as I go down your longer list. Have you gotten enough answers to the first 5, do you think, or do we need to get some more clarification in those?
Well, the one question is in regards to the multiple areas for the open yard. The different suggestions, whether it be the lot size is 7,500 square feet. I'm trying to find it real quick. whether it be the 7,500 square feet that the Planning Commission initially recommended or whether it be the 6,000 square feet that we think is more appropriate and truly reflects the hardship, or even the median size of 7,000 square feet, which was based on our research of past modification requests.
Well, for me, the 6,000 works because that's where you actually are having that particular need to break it up. When you get the larger lots, you already have more flexibility unless you begin to overdevelop the lots. So it seems to me that if you have this lower limit, less than 6,000 feet, then you're addressing it where it has been a real issue, and you're not opening up another can of worms. The larger lots have more flexibility, so that's my rationale for supporting the staff's recommendation.
That's also my viewpoint. Mr. Francisco?
Just one question. So when you were researching this, and the point of this is getting rid of useless modifications, right? I mean, the point of it...
That could be an effect, but I think the first point is to think of whether or not this is an appropriate standard.
Right.
And then it probably will have the effect of reducing some modifications.
Okay.
Yeah.
So when you did your survey, you found that the median size of the lots that were affected by this was 7,000 square feet. So just run past me one more time the rationale for choosing 6,000 if the median was 7,000.
Because not everybody relies not everybody's application is reasonable.
Right. I mean, you kind of need to look at the site-specific conditions.
Now, wait a minute. Was this total applications, or was this application granted?
It was
Ms. Reardon, you go ahead.
Chair Williams, Commissioner Francisco. It was the total applications granted. When I originally performed this research over a year ago, the average size was closer to 6,100 square feet. But over the last year, there has been some larger lots that have requested the open yard modification, and there's site-specific reasons why they were granted. They were over 10,000 square feet. And we don't typically grant those, so I believe that's what pushed the number higher.
I see.
Okay. I agree. There are different reasons
now.
on the larger lots.
Sure.
Sometimes people will have the house pushed way far back, or they'll have two front yards because it's a through lot. But to get at the purpose here, the smaller size,
Okay.
yes.
No, that makes sense. Fine. I'm fine with that.
An additional clarification is 6,000 square feet is the minimum size for the R1 zone. So that's another basis for our recommendation.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Mr. House?
Did we settle that issue about the slope? With the open yard, it was explained, and I'm not sure if it's clear where we came down on it. I tend to support the idea that behind a home where there's a slope of 20% or greater, or say 20% or less, and that could be the 20% slope could be considered open yard. And yet it's not useful for open yard. It's pretty, meaning plant on it or something, but the question is what could you use it for? And often when you have a slope like that and it's right up to a house, you have other problems. You have drainage off the slope right into your home, and so then people will put retaining walls and this and that. The question is, can that little area there be made into a usable space and counted as an usable open yard? Is that the right word? I get the wrong terms here, and I think that it can be. So I want to say that I would support that idea. I recognize the issue of the scarring of the hills and with these big retaining walls, but that's different from what we're talking about here. I don't believe that's the same. I think staff was pretty clear about it. I'm really clear. We're talking about a different world from they take and they level an entire half a hillside and then they put all these pods on it. That's not the thing, not in Santa Barbara anyway. So I support the concept that we have in front of us here.
What about porches and patios? They also conflict with our conservation element in the increase of impermeable space. I guess I had a question about that too.
And by the way, I'm not certain that they do. To the degree that they don't, I can definitely support it. It seems like most of these kinds of things that we've seen, at least when I was on Planning Commission, we would see these areas that then they would, garden them, they'd make them very pretty, or they would be a patio that would, like a deck. I think, in fact, that's how it's referenced in here. And those seemed like they made a lot of sense, but again, maybe there's more to it than I'm seeing.
The issue of how much of your lot can be paved under the municipal code, it's not a pretty picture. The city has not really grappled with that. And I think there's a lot of room for improvement in that regard. Whether or not this particular zoning standard would somehow be included in looking at that question of how much, impervious surface and how to deal with it. I'm just trying to think about the stormwater improvement, what are we calling it now? SWIMP. That's going to become a stormwater management program that'll be coming to the council, is laying some really good broad standards that I'm very much interested in seeing how they can become implemented in the zoning ordinance, and it could be in many, many different ways, but I think I get where the Chair Williams is coming from. This could be one of those areas where we want to set parameters about the materials used, the permeability, and all of that. But I'm not so sure that they're mutually exclusive. And we're trying to deal with just does the land count itself. And so from that standpoint, I really believe this is an improvement in our ordinance. And on that other point, we've got some work to do.
Right battle to fight, but wrong battlefield for dealing with this issue.
Yeah, I think it's part of this. I think that larger issue, we will want to work with Creeks Division and other folks at looking at how our zoning ordinance and what's allowed to pave in your open yard. And that'll be on flat open yards as well as sloped open yards. Because now in the flatland, you can pave your entire open yard. And that is a big problem, or could be, in different neighborhoods.
Sure. Mr. Francisco.
I just wanted to say that I agree with Mr. House. I fully support this idea of allowing, say, terracing or that should not somehow magically change what was an open yard into not an open yard anymore. So I think this is a good idea.
So to conclude, we've had maybe 3 points of maybe 2 points of contention with today's recommendations. One has been the setback requirements for mixed use, which I think I'm with Mr. House on that. I do believe that we want to, I guess the Mr. House that's seated up here on that, because I do believe that we should deal with the issue that Steve brought up, but I'm not sure that this is the right way to deal with it. In many ways, having a minimal amount of commercial is really beneficial to the city in minimizing how much commercial there is, the traffic impacts, and the growth-inducing factors of commercial. So in many ways, I want to promote mixed use to have as little commercial as is necessary or to draw people to the streetscape. And so I think that's why I'm going to stick with you on that, Grant. On the issue of the 3 or 6 feet for multifamily zones, I think I'm going to be with you, Mr. Francisco. I think, to me, stick with the more restrictive standard. The only way we would be able to handle it with some nuances is if this project has enough of a hook to have to ask for the modification in the first place. So if they don't have to ask for the modification, we can't deal as easily with the problem if we're not asking for enough. Sure.
Actually, that brings up a kind of an important point. If we take that approach, which is sort of the current approach, maybe some strengthened understanding of the value of whatever space would be, whatever that side yard setback would be there, what we're saying in a way is that there is a value, and I believe there is, for modifications. The modification process takes a look at each individual situation where there is a push, and you get to, well, okay, make a case. Make a case for it. Show us how that really does work, and how are you going to protect that concern that we have for how that space might be used for emergencies or whatever. What are you doing? Are you leaving that wall, are you taking the wall away so people can get through, like a carport? What are you doing? So I think that I think that we really shouldn't just throw out the whole idea of modifications altogether as if somehow they're wholly bad. If we have our ordinances well crafted, and then somebody comes through with a genuine proposal and can make a case, and it makes sense, and we have our process to do it, the modification process can result in a better development. It's different from giving out mods to everything just as easy as pie. You've got to, run the gauntlet. But I just wanted to say that out loud. I think that if we take that approach, and they have to ask for modification for it, and they have to demonstrate how they're meeting all these, addressing these concerns, then that could work. I get that.
Yes, but let you're talking about a mixed use still?
Just 3 comments on various different topics that you discussed.
On these substantive amendments or on the others? Sure. To make this proper procedure, I will ask Mr. House if he has any further questions or comments.
Well, yes, I do. On the subject of the 20 by 20 yard areas, I think that's a step in the right direction, or being able to break it up into different 400 square foot areas. I think that's a step in the right direction. But when you consider lots that are 6,000 feet or less, and there are a lot of 50 by 100 lots in Santa Barbara, so 5,000 square foot lots, it's actually that 20 by 20 that is the thing that's requiring, well, I don't know, in my experience, triggering the need for a mod, because you often have a hard time getting 20 feet this way or that way. Now, you might have 50 feet wide of property width by 15 feet deep, so it'd be nice if there were some kind of options to choose from. 400 square foot separate areas as long as they're a minimum of 20 by 20, or 600 square foot areas if they're a minimum of 15 feet, something like that, because right now I'm going to be applying for a mod on a 50 by 100 lot, and it is 4 encroaching 95 feet into this 20 by 20 area, but then that also renders it no longer 20 feet. But it would, I think, comply if you could jumble those numbers a little more. So appreciate if that could be given a little bit more look. As far as the mixed use, your committee member House's comment about vitalizing downtown, having the combination of commercial and residential. The particular project I was referring to, they squeezed in the commercial back away from the street. It's behind a front building. And so it's kind of the tail wagging the dog. I'm thinking if it's generally envisioned that it's a commercial area and some housing gets squeezed into it, but instead you have a housing project and you squeeze a little commercial into it, I don't know if that's how it was originally envisioned. So just asking that you look at it that way. And comments on the 3-foot garage setback. My recollection is in condos you usually have to provide some storage area for each unit, and that often takes place in a garage. And then people do store, whatever they don't have room for in their condo in a garage, and if it's a carport, that would be probably not a good idea. However, there are other requirements for landscaping between a building and a driveway or alongside a property line where there's a parking area that the ABR or HLC are able to waive if they're mitigating offsetting design proposals made, and perhaps this 3-foot thing could be something like that, that the requirement is 6, but a design review board, which is always going to be involved in an R3, R4 review, would have the power to reduce that to 3. And then they are looking at, okay, well, how many linear feet of encroachment is this? And let's ask the applicant to break this up a little bit more or come up with the appropriate landscaping. Thank you.
I think that's a great suggestion, that third one, a way to handle that. Do the committee members have any agreement or disagreement on that?
Thank you, Steve.
Is that a good
I'd like
solution?
to comment on that. Just as Mr. House was saying, there already is a similar provision when the boards are looking at the 3-foot planter strip along a driveway, and it is called out as a waiver. In the staff report, we were saying, well, they'd look at it, but this would make it very clear that they need to look at it and do just what Mr. House was suggesting. But it would be at the design board rather than design board and staff hearing officer. So I think that's a great idea.
That's an appropriate solution. So I think, Mr. Vincent, you see unanimous approval from the committee on changing that, and you would already have the model for how to emblazon that in code? Okay.
May we hear staff's response to the jumble it up concept? Because,
Yeah,
I mean, we've
I
got
thought we were
the
trying to-
modification process, I think, allows for that to be reconciled, but I may be misunderstanding. I think so.
Chair Williams, Councilmember House, it's a great idea. I wish we had this idea about maybe 5 or 6 months ago. I don't know, we're sort of on a timeline now, and I don't know, I'm torn about it because I like the idea. You know, we're looking for we're having a lot of difficulty ourselves among staff about how to deal with someone that's non-conforming open yard and what to do, and we're just not ready to say, you know, that's good or bad at this point. I'd rather just keep it at modifications for now, and we will put that on the list for future looking at.
Is there a way for us in the language of the 20 by 20 or whatever to express the intent so that that's there to help a modification officer or, staff show to work with it? Because if the intent is there, then there could be a finding made that this unique situation is consistent with that intent. I mean, it just seems like there should be the reason why we're doing it, if it can be expressed out loud, that would be helpful, because we're not trying to give away the store, but we are trying to have that little bit of flexibility, so something that would be reasonable could be adapted.
My take, having made the findings on a number of yard modifications, open yard modifications, and based on the staff's report and recommendations, we have to find that it meets the purpose and intent of the zoning ordinance. And I think the intent of the zoning ordinance in terms of providing adequate outdoor living space is well documented already. And that usually is the basis. We really do look at, the staff almost always gives you a total of the area that meets that purpose, and then they explain and show where it doesn't meet the dimension. So that's a fairly standard element of open yard modifications.
Do either of the committee members want to vote on these separately once we're ready to vote? Do we want to take out any portion? Francisco, do you want to vote on the mixed-use setbacks separately, or?
Actually, I mean, even though I have a lot of problems with mixed-use development, the way it's done, I don't disagree that this was something that was overlooked in the original intention. So, even though I don't like a lot of the results that this has generated, I don't disagree on that. And really, my only problem here has been with the giving away the 3-foot setback. I can't go along with that.
And I think this committee is now in agreement on how to handle that issue. I have one last issue, which is churches in the M zones. There are many churches in the M zones currently, and your original suggestion to Planning Commission was to allow churches in the C2, CM, and M1 zones without a CUP, but the Planning Commission recommended to strip the M zone out of that, as I understand it, and I vociferously disagree with that, given the fact that the M zone is probably the place where there's the most churches in town, and further restricting that, I think, would be in error. So I'll be curious to see how other committee members feel about that. Mr. House?
May I ask, isn't it, let's see, is it prohibited in the M1, or in the M zone, or is it allowed by conditional use permit? Yeah, to me, the conditional use permit process has been such a great tool for dealing with these different kinds of uses that are adjacent to other uses or in the middle of other uses, that it then brings out the potential conflicts and it addresses them in a very responsible way. I don't see that would, and one of the nice things about the churches in the M zone, for example, they use space that's otherwise not being used at that time. If it's a Saturday or Sunday, nobody's using that for their manufacturing, and so it can be, nobody's being bothered. Well, that would come out in a conditional use permit process. Then again, the question of uses during the rest of the week, when you might have very intensive, industrial work going on next door, those things would all come out and be addressed. So I don't think they should be prohibited in the M zone. But I have had, my experience as the city has had real success with the conditional use permit process. The only downside is it costs more to get in when you apply for a conditional use permit. But when it's all said and done, your neighbors have a concern or an issue, you can point to your conditional use permit and say, no, we're adhering to that. We're meeting all of our requirements, and so you've got something to hold on to. So I tend to appreciate I like the conditional use permit approach.
Can you explain to me why it should be handled different in the CM zone than in the M1 zone?
No, I can't, because I haven't actually thought about that. So I honestly don't have to.
Chair Williams, I can give you a little insight into why the Planning Commission wanted to restrict it in the M1. The M1 zone is the only zone that allows of what we consider in City of Santa Barbara to be heavy industrial, right? It's called a light industrial zone, but allows a lot of different things that no other zone, sort of noisy and smelly sometimes businesses. And the Planning Commission is very concerned about the losing, because the M1 zone also is the least restrictive of all zones, allows just about every use that any other zone allows except housing. And because it allows all these zones, all these uses like offices or retail or whatever, those higher dollar value rent types of uses are starting to encroach into the M1 zone, and thereby displacing the low rent industrial uses that the city wants to maintain. So when we came to the Planning Commission with a provision so that CUPs for churches would not be allowed, they said, well, this is just a further encroachment, I guess, into the uses of the M1 zone. This is just one more thing that can displace a light industrial use, and we don't want that. And and from a staff perspective, we thought that a CUP wouldn't be unreasonable either. So that's why we are where we are.
I kind of feel reality is actually the opposite of that religious establishments have existed in the M1 zone for, as long as Santa Barbara's been here, pretty much, almost as long as we've had something here. Even before there was an M1 zone,
yes,
the religious establishments existed in the M zone. And that if the Planning Commission wants to reduce encroachment, they need to handle commercial and office uses, not religious uses of the M1. I can only think of one case where that the latter point has taken place, and that's with Cavalry Chapel. I think that in fact it makes no sense to have a CUP requirement in the M1 zone for churches and not in the CM and C2 zones, and that when in doubt, the best thing to do is to have some consistency and to go along with previous staff practice, which was to allow churches in the C2, CM, and M1. So remember, what Planning Commission is suggesting to do here is to change current practice, which is to require a CUP where we have not required a CUP. And I think when in doubt, it's better to stick with less restrictions of religious institutions, especially when we have not found a need to restrict them in the past.
I would just like to add, to support Chair Williams' comments, churches and religious institutions used to be allowed in all zones. And it's only over time that each church existing kind of finds its way into our CUP process. And that has happened over time. But the CUP went in place in 1975. And it used to be allowed in single-family zones. So when you drive up San Roque neighborhood or whatever, those large churches, those were all put in initially without, of course, as same with the ones that you'll find scattered in the commercial zones. And again, I think this is an example of the Planning Commission feeling strongly about the M1, and it is a broader issue. And they took the opportunity to try to address a broader issue, just like, you all are inclined to try to do, but staff's initial position really was the same as the chair's. We felt it was appropriate to continue to allow them as allowed uses.
And I agree, I think, with Mr. Williams on this one, especially if Planning Commission's concern is encroachment on the manufacturing zone, and the major source of that encroachment is office and retail, then let's deal with that.
So can I get a motion on the zoning changes with, I suppose, we have one point of still disagreement, which is the church's issue.
Chair Williams, it's not a strong point of disagreement.
Okay, all right.
I just was trying to articulate the rationale for it. I mean, there's all the churches that we know of that are spread all over the town, including in the M zones, are non-conforming. They've been there for, ever, as far as we're concerned. And there's only one that came up recently, which is Calvary Chapel over there, and that one is using that kind of space, which is pretty innocuous. I mean, some would say it's displacing manufacturing space, and I think that's what they're going for with the Planning Commission. But I don't think we have a major problem yet. The big problem has more to do with the conversion to offices and that kind of thing, which could be. So I don't have a big issue with it. If it comes up in Plan Santa Barbara, then we can, if it does, then we can deal with it at the other end.
So can I get a motion on recommending this to council?
So moved.
In a second?
Second.
And Mr. Vincent needs a clarification?
Yes, Mr. Chair. As I understand, there are two outstanding changes that the committee has discussed today. The first, I want to rerun us all back to 6.08010 on the first page of today's draft ordinance. This is the chicken section.
Yes.
We will make revisions consistent with the intent of following that the chickens will be in the rear yard. They will not be in the front yard, and they will observe an interior yard setback. Interior setback, excuse me. The other change, I believe, is the R3 3-foot or 6-foot interior setback for garages. I understand the intent of the committee, and I will redraft that to follow the same kind of waiver language that is seen in the interior yard parking requirements, where for the commercial zones that are adjacent to residentially zoned parcels. That is the waiver process that the public member, Mr. House, was referencing.
And the change in the churches.
Churches.
We have a motion and a second. All those in favor, say aye.
Aye. Aye.
Opposed? We're done.
Thank you very much.